So today's video is about T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality, which falls under the our literary criticism lectures. And speaking about T.S. Eliot, who's very famous, we don't need to introduce him. But for those who study, T.S. Eliot for the first time in literary criticism, we cannot skip Eliot when it comes to modern time, to modern literature, and also to modern criticism. He's one of the founders of modern criticism, and he has some significant theories in this field. So Thomas Stearns Eliot is considered to be one of the most influential critics of the modern era. Why is influential? Let's see what he has to do with criticism. For Eliot, English criticism was in a chaotic situation. Actually, literary criticism as a discipline is not something very old. Actually, it's very recent. So there's this problem with these recent fields that how can we establish a systematic discipline with terminology, with theories that we can rely on and we can use and apply on literature. Okay, for him, for Eliot, as a critic, if we think about Eliot and as a critic, what let's say school he followed, he was considered a classicist. He followed the classical school. But what does this mean? He declares that criticism must be ordered and it must have a standard. So what are the standards? What are the theories that we can base our study on as a critic? What are my theories? What are my theories? On what I'm depending in order to, let's say, in order to use, let's say, this theory, for example, or try to practice literary criticism based on a theory that I already have, but not any theory, of course. We are talking about consistent theories, well-formed theories. Okay, for Eliot, this was something that the English criticism was lacking. Okay, if we come to the romantic criticism or the romantic view of literature, this was condemned by Eliot. He thinks that it doesn't adhere to any standard. It depends on the writer's personal or individual talent, and we all know that when we speak about romanticism, we are speaking about the stress and the emphasis that's placed on the individual's let's say individuals own expressions and personal experiences. This kind of glorifying of the individuality is very characteristic of the romantic mentality. For Eliot, this was a problem, okay, because we cannot base our let's say attempt on creating a disciplined on a disciplined systematic criticism on personal basis or individual basis. We should have a standard, and standard that is more objective than subjective. You see, actually, when we look at these ideas, we can feel that there is a kind of influence by the scientific way of thinking. And we all know that Eliot was an admirer of Matthew Arnold, and Matthew Arnold in literary criticism, who lived in the Victorian period and was greatly influenced also by this idea, the scientific way of thinking, which follows certain steps, which is very objective, and which always stress on having a standard, a theory. Okay, so it seems that this is an attempt to create objectivity and a kind of scientific methodology in order to make literary criticism an ordered and well-formed discipline. Okay, in an essay which is entitled Tradition and the Individual Talent, which was published in 1919, Eliot voiced a number of his let's say ideas and and points regarding uh, this point about the objectivity that we should follow in order to reach a certain standard. So what does he say? He says a piece of art should be sublime, complex, and objective. How could a piece of art be objective? And this is actually, this is a very shocking, actually, I would say this. It's a very shocking idea. How can you produce an art that is objective? We all know that arts in general, literature, poetry, I mean, this process of producing art is very subjective. But how can we produce an objective art? According to Eliot, this is possible, but how? The idea of tradition, where tradition is simply a current of literary writings. What does Eliot mean by tradition? Actually, Eliot was trying to connect the past to the present. He was trying to say that actually our tradition, our, let's say, past uh, tradition of literature and writings is not separate from our modern times. As a poet, as a writer, I should find my position in this tradition. I should connect. I should be able to find what are the things that connect my writings, my ideas with the past. I should find my place in this tradition. Okay? The poet can identify himself in tradition by refining his historical sense, being conscious of the writers of the past. Okay? There is a long line of writings that starts, I think, from Homer. If we can go back very ancient to very ancient times, it goes back to Homer and starts from there, and it goes on and continues till our time. As a writer, where is your position in this whole tradition? You should establish yourself. Okay, the poet must subtract his personal feelings and emotions. He should be impersonal. As a writer, I should not follow my own personal feelings and emotions and speak about them as if they are um, the important thing that I need to communicate. No, I should detach myself from them and try to be as objective as possible in order to reach to the audience with feelings and emotions they can relate to, they can understand, and they can think about. Okay, because if I speak about my personal feelings, how can people understand what am I saying? Because these are, after all, very special to me, just as an individual. But if I speak about them in terms of some impersonal manner or way of writing, then I can communicate them to other people in a better way so that they can relate to them, they can interact to them, they become universal. This is the idea he's trying to show. But what does it mean to be impersonal, or how can we achieve this? And this is the challenge, okay, of a poet and a writer, according to Eliot. Eliot objected the exaggerated need to express the human personality and subjective feeling to the point that makes poetry a kind of self-worship. He declined this. And of course, we all know that the Romantics were very subjective in terms of expressing their feelings. They glorified, they have given an exaggerated importance to the expression of the self, the personal and the subjective. Okay, the poet must surrender himself totally to the creative work. But what does this mean? Or if we read these notes here, maybe we think that what is the, let's say, what's the method? As a writer, what should I do? What's my function, or what's my role, task as a poet? Okay, the poet, notice here this note, the poet should be passive and impersonal. Okay, and in this manner, criticism should be directed toward the poem, not the poet. It seems Eliot has something about the poet. He wants to make the poet detached from his work. So in this way, If I want to criticize a work, I should not go to the life of the author or the poet and think about the influences on him that made him write or create this work. This is not going to be useful, according to Eliot. I should only criticize the poem. I should treat the poem as a whole, as an entity by itself. I should analyze and study the elements inside the poem alone, and by doing this, I can come up with a very suitable analysis without regarding anything about the poet. And here we can think about the influence of formalism. Actually, Eliot is considered one of the founders of formalism in English criticism. The influence of formalism is very clear in this point. To study the poem, just the poem, to deal with the poem as a unit by itself, okay, and the different elements. And here we can think about the elements inside a poem that are what? Linguistic elements, stylistic elements. If we analyze them, we can come up with an understanding of this poem, and this is how we should criticize a poem, okay, regardless of any historical or contextual details about the author or about the time the poem was written. The poet only uses language to incorporate within the poem feelings and emotions that are not personal but common to all humankind. Okay, as a poet, you should not speak about your personal feelings. And interestingly, he uses an analogy which is taken from chemistry. And this is what I was talking about when I said there is an influence of the scientific method of thinking. What is this analogy? The analogy of the catalyst. In order to explain his theory, Eliot draws the following analogy. The personality of a poet is like a shred of platinum. In the reaction between sulfur dioxide and oxygen, platinum filament is used as a catalyst. After the reaction, sulfurous acid is produced, but platinum remains unchanged. So, in chemical reactions, when we bring some element and we want to make a reaction, for example, I have two elements just like here, sulfur dioxide and oxygen. But these elements need some catalyst, some factor or helping factor in order to make this reaction happen, takes place. Okay, what is this factor or this helping factor? It is the platinum filament, or sometimes some reactions need heat, to apply some heat, and after the reaction happens there is some kinds of final product. Okay, but when we think about the platinum filament, it didn't do anything inside the reaction, it was just helping the reaction to take place. Okay, it is not part of the reaction or not part of the final product, but it was just helping the reaction to happen. This is the same for the poet. According to Eliot, the poet is just a catalyst. He is the medium. He is the medium. He helps the feelings and emotions to be communicated, but he's not part of this final product. He's not part of the poem. Okay, he just finds a way in order to communicate these feelings in an impersonal way, and the final product is not related to him. He still he becomes detached from it, separate from it. Okay, so the poet must be as objective as a scientist. And here this is an interesting quote by him. He says, the more perfect the poet, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. According to Eliot, if you are a very good poet, perfect poet, you should be able to know when you are speaking as someone who's suffering from certain feelings, and when you are using your mind in order to create something artistic. What makes a great poet is the ability to know this thin line that separates these two things. Okay, this is according to Eliot. Now let's see, how can a poet achieve this, or what are the maybe devices, techniques? Did Eliot give anything that could help in achieving this objectivity that he's talking about? The only way of expressing emotion through art is by finding an objective correlative. And by the way, objective correlative is not the invention of Eliot. If you go back to the history of this term, you can see that it was actually coined and used, I think, by I'm not aware of the name of the person, but I think he's a painter, maybe. I think he's a painter. He coined actually this term, and it was taken by Eliot and developed and given more accurate description. What does it mean to create an objective correlative? A set of objects, situation, a chain of events, or reactions that can effectively serve to awaken in the reader the emotional response which the author desires, without being a direct statement of that emotion. So instead of telling the audience or the readers how this character feels, what are the emotions she is suffering from, what are the things that are going in her mind, I could create a situation and place this character in, or maybe I could create chain of events, or maybe I could describe the place or the environment around this character, and based on that, as a reader, you could know the feelings, or the feelings are going to be communicated to you. Okay, I didn't state anything directly. You as a reader were able to conclude and to understand this. This is what he means by keeping yourself separate from your work. Okay, for example, if your character experienced loss and you want to evoke sadness and longing in the reader, your character is maybe has lost someone dear to them. How can you make the reader feel the same sadness that this character has felt? If we use the technique that Eliot is telling us to use, which is objective correlative, I, for example, can describe the atmosphere around this character. Maybe she's walking somewhere and maybe she's looking out of the window, and the atmosphere outside is maybe raining, very gloomy, maybe it's winter. I could speak about the coldness of the weather, maybe the sky looks very pale and gloomy. All these things, when I describe them, I can create in you as a reader this feeling of sadness in the air that the character is feeling. Okay, so instead, through giving sensory experiences and descriptions of the environment, I can create this feeling and influence on the reader. Okay, and of course, by the way, I have just mentioned objective correlative, but if we go to the theory itself and you read about Eliot's theory of impersonality, you can find actually many details, many examples. I'm trying here just to give brief idea. What about the criticism that was given to the theory? Of course, it's not a theory that all accepted. Some actually thought about this theory and gave us critique of it. Some charged Eliot that he had thus committed himself to the most romantic theory possible. And this is ironic, by the way, because some say that by trying to be as objective as possible, Eliot goes back to subjectivity. It seems it's impossible to escape subjectivity, even if you want to. How? Because the poet, notice the second point, the poet is reduced into an agent whose role only to produce a poem in some unconscious manner. When he says that the only task that the poet has to do is just be a catalyst, just be the medium in which the feelings are transferred to the reader. Some say that this is actually the most unconscious way of writing, as if this poet is not a conscious being, as if he's doing things out of his subconscious, not knowing what he's doing, not knowing what are these things that he's expressing. This is very subjective indeed. Okay? Eliot was trying to create an objective standard for literary practice because individuality was condemned concept after war. When you speak about the times in which Eliot was producing these theories, and it is the modern time and specifically the time of the world wars, these were very turbulent times, and there was this kind of confusion regarding the what are the human values that we still have and we can still believe in after all the atrocities we have seen in wars. You see, this is a very crucial question, and one of the questions that that was asked in that period, because we saw what this emphasis on individuality led us to. It led us to very terrible and heinous wars, killing, torture, suffering. So how can we rely on individuality anymore? Okay, so it was condemned, and when we try to look at a substitute for that, and for Eliot, the substitute for such individuality that actually destroyed humanity, we should go back to the classical period, to our tradition. We should look back again. Okay, so, and we try to avoid subjectivity, and this means we have to be objective. You see, this is, we can think about it like something like a reaction. This is the criticism that was given to this theory, that even though it was trying to be objective, it revealed that it is more subjective than being objective. And this is because who decides what are the standards upon which we measure our literary work? Who decides? Who says that, for example, this work is let's say the greatest work that has been written in poetry, for example? Who decides? And even the one who decides this, what are the bases? I mean, when you say, for example, that Shakespeare is the greatest dramatist, if we ask someone, how did you know that he's the greatest dramatist? They would say, actually, everybody agrees on that. What if someone comes and says, actually, I didn't like Shakespeare, his work is rubbish? Maybe something like this. You see, you can think of literature as not only very subjective field, but also it is based on some kind of personal judgment and taste. Maybe I feel that Shakespeare is great. Others would say, no, I think that maybe Christopher Marlowe is the greatest dramatist. So even these agreed on opinions and standards, even these could be what? Could be questioned. Okay? Who decides? Actually, even if there's someone who decides and we agree on that, still it could be questioned. Okay? When we come to Eliot, and by the way, Eliot is the one who introduced to us the metaphysical poets. Okay, this is one of his contributions. He is the one who introduced metaphysical poets who are not very well known, or somehow they were neglected, maybe. Their work was not given emphasis. It was not canonical. You see, it was not canonical until Eliot wrote an essay about them, and he gave us highlights about their poetry. So it was Eliot who actually appreciated and glorified the 17th century poets known as metaphysical. And why did he do that? What's so special about metaphysical? Those who studied metaphysical poetry know very well what kind of poetry they produced. But what captured the attention of Eliot is, notice here, he appreciates their poetry for their ability to unify both wits and emotions in a balanced form. They were not totally subjective nor totally objective. So it seems that Eliot was trying to uh, speak about such balance that we could create in our works, neither be so subjective nor very objective. And he gave us an important highlight about the work of the metaphysical poets, who, according to his opinion, were able to achieve this balance, to be objective and subjective at the same time in a balanced way. Okay, they are speaking about personal sufferings, maybe, or personal thoughts or feelings, but they are also able to employ these feelings in an objective way so that other people also would understand and relate to them. Okay, and that was all for our video today for T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality. It's very interesting, actually, and Eliot himself is a very important figure in the modern period, whether in his poetry, whether in his criticism. And this presentation was very, actually very brief. You could go on and read more about it. You can read even the essays that he has written, Tradition and Individual Talent, and other essays that are actually considered to be important works of literary criticism. So as a student of literary criticism, you could go back to them and read and have an idea more about the theories and ideas of T.S. Eliot in English literary criticism. That was all for today. I hope to see you in other videos soon.